The scream that never left Clara's throat echoed through the empty desert as she pressed her daughter closer to her chest. In the dying light of another merciless day, the Red Hand Gang had found their isolated cabin, and with it, the last remnants of her carefully built sanctuary. "Please, not in front of my child," she whispered, knowing that some prayers fall on deaf ears in this godless land. The outlaw's laughter cut through the evening air like broken glass, and Clara realized that everything she had fought to protect was about to be torn away. But in the shadows beyond the firelight, something stirred, something that would make the devils themselves remember what fear truly meant. Subscribe to witness how darkness meets its match in the most unexpected places. The cabin had been Clara's fortress for 3 years, a small wooden promise she had built with her own hands after the fever took her husband. Every plank, every nail, every carefully chinked gap between the logs represented her determination to carve out a life for herself and 5-year-old Lily in this unforgiving wilderness. The vegetable garden behind the house grew in neat rows, defying the desert's hunger, while the well she had dug provided clear, cold water that tasted like hope itself. This was more than shelter. It was proof that a woman could survive, could thrive, could raise a child with dignity even when the world seemed determined to crush her spirit. But on this particular evening, as the sun bled orange across the horizon, Clara felt the familiar chill of dread creeping up her spine. Lily sat at the rough-hewn table, carefully drawing pictures of horses with a piece of charcoal, her small tongue poking out in concentration. The child's innocence filled the cabin like warm lamplight, making everything seem possible, making Clara believe that tomorrow would be better than today. She moved quietly around their small domain, preparing their simple supper of beans and cornbread, listening to Lily's soft humming, and feeling grateful for these precious moments of peace. The world outside might be harsh and unforgiving, but here, within these walls, love still had meaning. The first sign of trouble came with the sudden silence of the evening birds. Clara's hands stilled on the wooden spoon she'd been using to stir their meal, her mother's instincts screaming warnings that her mind was still trying to process. Lily looked up from her drawing, her wide blue eyes reflecting the same unease that was now coursing through Clara's veins like ice water. The horses in the small corral behind the house began to whinny and stamp, their distress carrying on the still air like a funeral bell. Clara moved to the window, her heart hammering against her ribs, and peered through the gap in the curtains she had sewn from flour sacks. What she saw there made her blood turn to winter. 5 riders sat motionless on the ridge above their cabin, their silhouettes dark against the dying light, like harbingers of Judgment Day. Even from this distance, Clara could see the red bandanas that marked them as members of the notorious Red Hand Gang, the same outlaws who had been terrorizing homesteaders throughout the territory for months. Their leader, a man called Snake Morrison, was said to be as cruel as he was cunning, leaving behind a trail of burned homes and broken families wherever his gang rode. Clara had heard the stories in town, had seen the haunted looks in the eyes of those lucky enough to survive encounters with these devils, but she had always believed that her remote location would keep them safe. Now, watching them descend toward her cabin like wolves closing in on wounded prey, she realized how foolish that hope had been. "Mama?" Lily's voice was small and uncertain, the child's intuitive understanding of danger making her press closer to Clara's skirts. Clara forced herself to breathe, to think, to find some way to protect the most precious thing in her world. The rifle hung above the fireplace, loaded and ready, but she knew that one woman with one gun would be no match for 5 hardened killers. Her mind raced through possibilities, the root cellar where they stored vegetables, the space beneath the floorboards where she kept her small savings, anywhere that might hide a child until this nightmare passed. But even as she considered these options, she knew with sickening certainty that there would be no hiding from what was coming. The Red Hand Gang had found them, and mercy was not a word in their vocabulary. The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, each thundering step bringing Clara's world closer to its end. She pulled Lily close, breathing in the sweet scent of her daughter's hair, memorizing the feel of the small body pressed against her own. Whatever happened next, whatever these men demanded or threatened or took, she would not let them touch her child. This promise burned in her heart like a sacred flame, giving her strength even as terror threatened to overwhelm her completely. The hoofbeats stopped just outside their door, and Clara heard the creak of leather as the riders dismounted, their spurs jingling like devil's bells in the gathering darkness. The knock on the door came like thunder, violent and demanding, shaking the entire cabin with its force. Clara's hands trembled as she lifted Lily into her arms, the child's small fingers clutching at her mother's dress with desperate strength. "Stay quiet, sweetheart," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible even to herself. "No matter what happens, stay quiet." Lily nodded solemnly, her blue eyes wide with the kind of fear that no child should ever have to know. The knock came again, harder this time, and Clara heard the rough laughter of men who had never learned to respect anything sacred or pure. Her legs felt like water as she approached the door, knowing that opening it would invite evil into the sanctuary she had worked so hard to build. "We know you're in there, lady," came a voice from outside, gravelly and cruel, dripping with the kind of confidence that came from never having faced real consequences. "Name's Snake Morrison, and these here are my boys. We've been riding hard all day, and we're in need of some hospitality." More laughter followed, the sound making Clara's skin crawl with revulsion. She pressed her back against the door, as if her small frame could somehow keep the darkness at bay, while Lily buried her face against her mother's shoulder. The silence stretched between them like a held breath, and Clara found herself praying to a god who seemed to have forgotten this lonely corner of his creation. "Please," she begged silently, "please, let them ride on. Let them find some other target for their cruelty." But prayers, Clara had learned, were often answered in ways that broke the heart rather than healed it. The door exploded inward with a crash that sent splinters flying across the cabin floor, and suddenly their small sanctuary was filled with the stench of unwashed bodies and whiskey-soaked breath. Snake Morrison stepped through the ruined doorway like a demon emerging from hell itself, his cold eyes taking in every detail of their humble home with the calculating gaze of a predator. Behind him came 4 more men, each one more frightening than the last, their faces bearing the kind of scars that spoke of violence as a way of life. Clara backed away, clutching Lily so tightly that the child whimpered softly against her neck, but there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide from the evil that had invaded their world. "Well, well," Snake drawled, his voice like gravel scraping against stone. "Looks like we found ourselves a real pretty little family." His gaze lingered on Clara with an intensity that made her feel sick to her stomach, while his men spread out through the cabin like locusts, overturning furniture and pawing through their meager possessions. One of them, a gap-toothed brute with arms like tree trunks, grabbed the cornbread from the table and stuffed it into his mouth, crumbs falling from his lips as he grinned at Clara's obvious distress. Another began pulling books from the small shelf Clara had built, tearing pages from the volumes and letting them flutter to the floor like dying butterflies. These were more than possessions being destroyed. They were memories, dreams, the careful accumulation of a life built from nothing. "Please," Clara found her voice at last, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Take whatever you want, but leave us be. We have nothing of value, nothing worth your trouble." Snake's laughter was like the sound of breaking glass, sharp and cutting, designed to wound. He stepped closer, close enough that Clara could smell the rot on his breath, could see the cruelty that lived behind his eyes like a permanent resident. Lily whimpered again, and Clara felt her daughter's small body trembling against her own, the child's terror feeding her mother's growing desperation. The other men continued their destruction, but Clara could feel their attention focused on her and Lily, could sense the terrible anticipation that filled the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Nothing of value? Snake repeated, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than any shout. Lady, I think you're selling yourself short. His hand reached out toward Lily's golden hair, and Clara jerked backwards so violently that she nearly fell, her maternal instincts overriding every other consideration. The movement made Snake smile, an expression so devoid of humanity that it seemed to suck the warmth from the air itself. That's a real pretty little girl you got there, he continued, his words dripping with implications that made Clara's blood turn to ice. Real pretty indeed. The other men had stopped their ransacking now, their attention drawn to the drama, unfolding before them like spectators at some twisted theatre performance. And Clara realized with growing horror that this had been their intention all along. The silence stretched between heartbeats, thick as desert dust, while Dusty's presence filled the doorway like a storm cloud gathering on the horizon. Clara felt the shift in the air, the way predators sense when they've become prey, and watched as Jake's confident sneer faltered into something resembling uncertainty. The cowboy's hat cast his face in shadow, but she could see the glint of steel at his hip, the way his hand rested easy and ready like a man who had made peace with violence long ago. Lily's breathing had quieted against her chest, as if even a child could sense that death had entered their small sanctuary, patient and inevitable as winter. The other gang members shifted nervously behind their leader, their earlier bravado evaporating like morning mist under the desert sun. Clara realized she was witnessing something rare and terrible, the moment when evil recognizes a force greater than itself. Jake's voice cracked slightly when he spoke, though he tried to mask it with bluster and false courage. Well, well, if it ain't the famous Dusty Morgan, he said, but his hand had moved instinctively toward his gun, a gesture that spoke louder than his words. The cowboy said nothing, simply stood there like judgment itself, and Clara could feel the weight of his silence pressing down on the room like a physical thing. She had heard whispers of Dusty Morgan in town, stories told in hushed voices about a man who tracked killers across impossible distances, who appeared like a ghost when justice demanded satisfaction. Now she understood why grown men crossed themselves when they spoke his name, why mothers used his legend to frighten children into obedience. The air itself seemed to thicken with unspoken threats and promises, while outside, even the wind had stilled, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Clara pressed her lips to Lily's hair, tasting salt and fear, knowing that whatever happened next would change everything. The standoff stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap at the slightest provocation, while Clara's heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird, desperate for freedom. She could see the calculation in Jake's eyes, the way he was measuring distances and odds, weighing his reputation against his survival instincts. The other outlaws had begun to spread out slightly, their movements subtle but unmistakable, like wolves circling wounded prey. Dusty noticed everything, his gaze moving between them with the cold precision of a man who had survived too many such moments to count. Clara found herself studying his face, searching for some sign of mercy or compassion, but found only the weathered features of a man who had seen too much darkness to believe in easy redemption. The cabin felt smaller now, cramped with tension and the promise of violence, while shadows lengthened across the floor like reaching fingers. She realized with growing dread that her daughter was about to witness something no child should see, yet she was powerless to prevent it. "You're making a mistake, Morgan," Jake said, his voice steadier now, though sweat had begun to bead on his forehead despite the cooling air. "This ain't your fight, and these ain't your people." The cowboy's response was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of thunder. "Any man who threatens a woman and child makes it my fight." Clara felt something shift inside her chest, a flutter of hope mixed with terror, as she realized this stranger was willing to risk everything for people he'd never met. The outlaws exchanged glances, their earlier confidence crumbling like sandcastles before an incoming tide, and she could see them beginning to question their leader's judgment. Lily stirred against her, whimpering softly, and Clara smoothed her daughter's hair with trembling fingers, whispering wordless comfort, while her eyes remained fixed on the deadly tableau unfolding before them. The very walls seemed to pulse with tension, as if the cabin itself was alive and afraid. She understood now that she was witnessing something larger than a simple confrontation. This was the collision of two different worlds, two different codes of honor. Jake's hand moved toward his gun with deliberate slowness, like a man testing the temperature of dangerous waters, while his eyes never left Dusty's face. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you?" he sneered, but there was desperation creeping into his voice now, the sound of a man who knew he was outmatched but couldn't back down without losing everything. Clara watched the cowboy's expression remain unchanged, carved from stone and shadow, while his own hand hung loose and ready at his side. The other gang members were growing increasingly nervous, their eyes darting between their leader and the exits, calculating their chances of escape if things went wrong. She could smell their fear now, sharp and acrid, mixing with the scent of wood smoke and her own terror. The moment stretched impossibly long, like the pause between lightning and thunder, while Clara held her breath and prayed to a god she wasn't sure was listening. When Jake finally drew his weapon, the sound of metal against leather seemed to echo through eternity. The gunshot shattered the silence like breaking glass, followed immediately by Jake's scream of pain and rage as his weapon spun away from his shattered hand. Clara gasped and pulled Lily tighter, her daughter's cry of fear piercing through the ringing in her ears, while smoke drifted lazily from the barrel of Dusty's gun. The other outlaws froze like startled deer, their own weapons half drawn, suddenly understanding that they were facing something beyond their experience or skill. Jake clutched his bleeding hand to his chest, his face twisted with pain and humiliation, while his authority crumbled like a house built on sand. The cowboy's voice cut through the chaos with quiet authority. "Next man who moves dies." Clara felt tears streaming down her cheeks, though she couldn't say if they were from relief or terror, as she watched her tormentors transform from predators into prey in the space of a heartbeat. The cabin that had been her prison moments before now felt like a sanctuary again, protected by this silent guardian who had appeared like an answer to desperate prayer. The wounded outlaw's whimpering filled the cabin like the sound of a dying animal, while his companions stood frozen in tableau of defeat and indecision. Clara watched Dusty move with fluid grace, his gun never wavering as he stepped further into the room, and she marveled at how completely the balance of power had shifted in mere seconds. Jake's face had gone pale beneath his stubble, sweat mixing with tears of pain as he cradled his mangled hand, and she could see the exact moment when his bravado finally cracked completely. The other gang members looked like children caught stealing, their earlier menace replaced by the desperate calculation of cornered rats. Lily had stopped crying, but remained pressed against her mother's chest, her small fingers clutching Clara's dress like a lifeline in a storm. The air still tasted of gunpowder and fear, sharp and metallic on Clara's tongue, while outside the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. She realized she was holding her breath, afraid that any sound might shatter this fragile moment of salvation. Dusty's voice carried the weight of absolute authority when he spoke, each word measured and final as a judge's gavel. "You boys have a choice," he said, his eyes moving between the remaining outlaws like a hawk studying field mice. "You can ride out of here now and never come back, or you can join your friend in learning what real pain feels like." Clara could see the internal struggle playing out on their faces, pride warring with survival instinct, while Jake continued to moan and curse under his breath. The cowboy seemed to read their thoughts with supernatural clarity, adding quietly, "I know who you are, where you've been, and what you've done. The law's been looking for the Red Hand Gang for months." The words hit the outlaws like physical blows, and Clara watched their last vestiges of defiance crumble into dust. She found herself studying Dusty's profile, noting the lines around his eyes that spoke of too many hard decisions, Too many moments like this one. The silence that followed felt pregnant with possibility, as if the entire world was waiting to see which direction fate would turn. The gang members began to back toward the door, with the careful movements of men trying not to provoke a sleeping rattlesnake, their eyes never leaving Dusty's gun. Clara felt a surge of fierce satisfaction watching these men who had terrorized her reduced to cowering shadows of their former selves. Jake struggled to his feet, his injured hand pressed against his chest, his face a mask of pain and humiliation that would have moved her to pity under different circumstances. "This ain't over, Morgan," he gasped, but the threat sounded hollow, even to his own ears. The cowboy's response was soft as silk and twice as deadly. "For your sake, it better be." Clara could see the truth of it in Jake's eyes. He knew he had been beaten not just in skill, but in something deeper, something that went to the very core of what made a man dangerous. The other outlaws were already at the door, their eagerness to escape barely contained, while their leader stumbled after them like a broken king fleeing his fallen kingdom. She realized she was witnessing the end of something, the dissolution of a threat that had haunted her dreams for weeks. As the last of the gang members disappeared into the gathering darkness, Clara felt her legs give way beneath her, and she sank into the nearest chair with Lily still clutched in her arms. The silence that followed their departure felt different somehow, cleaner, as if the very air had been purified by justice. Dusty holstered his weapon with practiced ease, but his eyes remained alert, scanning the windows and doorway for any sign of treachery. Clara found her voice at last, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Thank you." The words seemed inadequate for what he had done, but they were all she had to offer. The cowboy turned to look at her then, and she saw something unexpected in his weathered features, not the cold calculation of a killer, but the gentle concern of a man who understood suffering. Lily peeked up from her mother's embrace, her tear-stained face curious and cautious, while outside the night sounds of the desert began to resume their ancient chorus. Clara realized that for the first time in months, she felt truly safe. The cowboy moved through her small cabin with the careful attention of a man checking for damage after a storm, his presence somehow making the familiar space feel larger and more secure. Clara watched him examine the broken doorframe where the outlaws had forced their way in, noting how his hands moved with surprising gentleness despite their obvious strength. "They'll be back," he said quietly, not looking at her, and she felt her heart sink like a stone in still water. Not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but men like that don't forget being humiliated. The truth of his words settled over her like a cold blanket, and she realized that her moment of salvation might be nothing more than a brief reprieve. Lily had fallen asleep in her arms, exhausted by fear and tears, her small body finally relaxed for the first time all day. Clara looked down at her daughter's peaceful face and felt a fierce protectiveness rise in her chest, stronger than fear, stronger than despair. She would not let these men destroy what little happiness they had managed to build in this harsh land. When she looked up, she found Dusty watching her with something that might have been respect. "I can't leave," Clara said, her voice stronger now, filled with the determination that had carried her through her husband's death and the long months of struggle that followed. "This is all we have, all Lily has ever known." The cowboy nodded slowly, as if he had expected this response, and she could see him thinking, weighing options and possibilities like a general planning a campaign. The lamplight flickered across his face, highlighting the scars and lines that told the story of a hard life lived on the edge of violence. "Then we'll have to make sure they understand the cost of coming back," he said finally, and Clara felt something shift in the air between them, a sense of alliance forming in the space where fear had been. She realized that this stranger, this legend made flesh, was offering to stand with her against the darkness that threatened to swallow her small world. The weight of his commitment settled over her like a warm cloak, and for the first time since her husband's death, she felt like she might not be facing the future alone. Outside, the desert wind whispered secrets to the stars, while inside, two souls found common ground in the simple desire to protect what mattered most. Dawn came slowly to the desert, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, while Clara stood at her window watching Dusty work in the yard below. He had spent the night on her porch, wrapped in his bedroll like a guardian angel made of leather and steel, and she had slept more peacefully than she had in months, knowing he was there. Now he was reinforcing her fence with practiced efficiency, his movements economical and sure, while Lily played nearby with a corn-husk doll her father had made before the fever took him. Clara felt something stirring in her chest as she watched this stranger care for her property as if it were his own, a warmth that had nothing to do with the rising sun. The coffee in her hands had grown cold while she stood there, lost in thoughts she hadn't dared entertain since becoming a widow. She realized that somewhere in the space between terror and salvation, something had changed inside her. Some wall had cracked that she had thought was permanent. The morning light seemed different somehow, full of possibilities she had forgotten existed. Dusty looked up from his work and caught her watching, and Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks as their eyes met across the distance. There was something in his gaze that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't experienced since her husband's death, as if he could look past the worn dress and calloused hands to the woman she had been before grief and hardship had worn her down. She raised her hand in a small wave, and he touched the brim of his hat in response, a gesture so simple yet so full of meaning that it made her heart skip like a schoolgirl's. Lily had noticed the exchange and was looking between them with the curious intelligence of a child who senses adult emotions without fully understanding them. Clara turned away from the window, busying herself with breakfast preparations, but she couldn't shake the feeling that her life had just taken a turn towards something she had never expected to find again. The bacon sizzled in the pan like the sound of her own awakening heart, while outside the man who had saved them continued his quiet work of making their world secure. The sound of approaching horses shattered the morning peace like stones through glass, and Clara felt her blood turn to ice as she recognized the familiar rhythm of multiple riders. Dusty was already moving, his hand on his gun, as he positioned himself between the house and the approaching threat, while Lily ran to her mother's side with the instinctive fear of a child who had learned too young that strangers meant danger. Clara peered through the window and felt her heart sink as she counted at least 6 riders, more than had come before, their faces hard with the promise of violence. These weren't the same men from yesterday. Jake had sent reinforcements, called in favors, or hired guns to settle the score that Dusty had written in blood and humiliation. The morning that had seemed so full of promise now felt like the calm before a terrible storm, and Clara realized that their brief respite had been nothing more than the eye of a hurricane. She pulled Lily close and whispered a prayer to whatever gods might be listening, while outside, Destiny approached on horseback with the sound of thunder. Dusty's voice carried clearly across the yard, calm and steady as bedrock despite the odds arrayed against him. "That's far enough," he called, and Clara could see the riders pull up just outside rifle range, their leader scanning the property with the calculating gaze of a professional killer. She recognized the type from the stories her late husband used to tell, men who sold their skills to the highest bidder, who measured their worth in the number of graves they had filled. The leader was a tall man with silver hair and cold eyes, wearing a black coat that marked him as someone who took pride in his deadly profession. Clara felt Lily trembling against her side and smoothed her daughter's hair with shaking hands, trying to project a calm she didn't feel. The standoff stretched like a taut wire, each side measuring the other, while the desert sun climbed higher and the shadows grew shorter. She realized that this moment would determine not just their survival, but the entire shape of their future, and she found herself praying not just for safety, but for the strength to face whatever came next. The silver-haired gunman's voice carried the cultured tones of an educated man who had chosen violence as his profession, making him somehow more frightening than the crude outlaws who had come before. "Mr. Morgan," he called, his words precise as a surgeon's blade, "my employer has authorized me to offer you a substantial sum to simply ride away from this place." Clara felt her heart clench at the words, knowing that money could be a powerful temptation for a man who lived by his gun. She watched Dusty's back, searching for any sign of wavering, any indication that he might be considering the offer. The silence stretched between the two men like a challenge, while the hired guns behind their leader shifted restlessly in their saddles, hands hovering near their weapons. Clara realized she was holding her breath, waiting for Dusty's response, knowing that his next words would seal their fate one way or another. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. "Tell your employer that some things aren't for sale." The words hit Clara like a physical blow, flooding her with relief and something deeper, something that felt dangerously close to love. The gunfight that followed was brief and terrible, a symphony of violence played out in smoke and thunder, while Clara shielded Lily's eyes and prayed for it to end. She heard Dusty's rifle speak 3 times in rapid succession, followed by screams and the sound of horses bolting in panic, while return fire splintered the wood around their windows. The silence that followed felt different from before, heavier somehow, weighted with the finality of death and the bitter taste of victory earned in blood. When Clara finally dared to look outside, she saw Dusty standing alone in the yard, smoke drifting from his rifle barrel, while 3 bodies lay motionless in the dust and the surviving gunman fled toward the horizon. The silver-haired leader was among the dead, his black coat spread around him like the wings of a fallen angel, and Clara realized that the threat that had haunted her dreams was finally, truly over. She felt tears streaming down her face, though whether they were from relief or grief or something else entirely, she couldn't say. When Dusty turned toward the house, she saw something in his eyes that told her he had paid a price for their safety, some piece of his soul that could never be reclaimed. But he had chosen to pay it willingly, for her, for Lily, for the simple right of decent people to live in peace.